I am the director.
You're loud. I'm just pulling it out.
It sounds better, right? I sound so official. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm the director of client success here at Engage. I'm a co-organizer. So we're sponsors and we're co-organizers. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Engage just so we can welcome you to our wonderful building with the wonderful view when you have the screen up. So take a minute to look out the window when you get a chance. Engage is a purpose-driven technology and business consulting company. We can do anything from designing, building, and delivering strategic business solutions. We are very passionate about giving back into the community. If you look back on the wall over there, we talk about being the change you wish to see in the world. We all pick something that we're passionate about, and we go after it, and the company backs us by helping donate to the organizations that we give to. We do a bunch of really cool things. We're a really cool company to work for. If you're ever looking for a place, give us a ringy-ding. And we're always looking for great clients as well. This got started with John Heckler. I'm going to have him come up here. But before I do that, we want to take a moment to talk about things going on in the community. And the big one right now is Momentum Conference. Michael Richardson, you want to give a quick plug for it? Sure. You want to go up there? Yeah, whatever you want to do.
Keep going here.
Yes.
If you're not going to Momentum, I don't know why.
Yeah.
But it's a week from Thursday on the 19th. Tickets are still available, so get that on that as soon as possible. It's going to be a great event. We've got 35 sessions of content down at the Hard Rock Casino downtown. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And it is a developer-focused meetup.
But there is a lot of content. We've had product managers and scrum masters and a lot of others that have joined us and really enjoyed the content that we offer. We have a full soft skills track, so there's lots of opportunity.
A lot of networking.
It is.
So true. Yes.
Great opportunity. So I know for you people looking to network, it's great if you have a chance to go. I've been there. And we'll have a booth there, so stop by and say hello.
Yeah, thank you, Engage.
Any other opportunities or events going on that somebody wants to mention?
In November, Queen City Security Conference is going on.
Oh, okay.
The website's going to be updated. It's actually held similarly to this meetup as well as Momentum, started local. And I'll get you more details, Leslie, that we can broadcast out. But
Okay.
A lot of the co-founders are from local companies.
That's great. Okay, good. All right. Anything else? Yes, Jim.
I know it's almost here, but Give Camp.
Yeah, Southwest Ohio Give Camp. You want to say a little bit about it?
Sure, I'll say a little about it. So Southwest Ohio Give Camp, if you haven't been to it before, it's an opportunity for nonprofits to come in, nonprofits from the area to come in. They have projects they want to do. A lot of times it's a website redesign, or sometimes we're building an inventory system, so it just depends. But we need developers, we need testers, we need UX designers, we need people that can run projects and keep things moving. But it's a weekend. It's this weekend, actually, 13th through the 15th. You can sign up, southwestohiogivecamp.org. I think volunteers can still sign up. I don't know.
That's why I didn't mention. I wasn't sure, but I'm sure they would use you if you're interested.
I'm showing up on the day before.
Yeah, okay. They're not going to turn you away. And again, great networking, great experience. People love it, and Engage has been active with it for years. So, okay, all right, that's it. We will meet again on November 15th. Too is our next API meetup.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you. I promise I'll be brief. I just want to thank Engage and Leslie and Phil and everyone here that has done a ton of hard work organizing these things and schedule them, get them, making this happen. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. So I would also like to thank Robert for being our speaker this time, and tease you a little bit. We have additional topics lined up for the next meetup, so keep coming, and we'll keep lining up some interesting talks. Without further ado, Robert.
Hello, all. Is that too close? All right. Tonight, we're going to talk about unraveling authorization and APIs. This kind of came up from last week or last month, kind of a topic of interest. I had several that I could dive into, but this one seemed to pique the most interest. Full disclaimer, these opinions are my own. They're not past companies or current companies that I work for. They're my own opinions, and don't take them as any legal advice or design advice or whatnot. Just, it's my thoughts. So let's start off with terminology soup. Authorization is a mess. It is a massive acronym soup. It has all kinds of complex terms. They overlap each other. So we're going to go through quick definitions on a few things, talk about a few core principles. Then we'll talk about kind of what's the future of authorization, where I see it going, and how to get to the golden goose of the current track is field level access control to comply with regulatory systems, as well as the new data threat that is out there. So going to kind of start off, because I don't know where everyone is on the authentication authorization landscape, is just want to do a quick, round robin of what is authentication, what is authorization. A lot of companies will go out there and try to sell you their platform of, IAM software, or, the SSOs and things out there that kind of merge all these terms together. So let's separate them. Authentication is purely about your credentials, verifying who you are, who you say you are, and assuring that you have access to the account that you're using. Authorization is more about what you have access to. This is your permissions. A lot of times in the OAuth2 world, they use the scenario to kind of go through this as when you go to a festival, or you go to a big show or outdoor event, you have to prove you are over 21 to get an alcohol ban. You use that alcohol ban, that's your authorization to buy alcohol. Kind of the same idea. You're proving your credentials first. That's one piece of it that says you're Robert Buchanan. And then you get the authorizations. So with authorizations, there's a lot of frameworks out there. There's OAuth2, OIDC. A lot of time they're used together. They're usually talked about in the same vein. There is slightly of a difference. OAuth2 is a framework that was primarily designed for authorization. It was built on a specification on how to communicate authorizations through systems without having a person sign in or do server-side rendered pages. It was more along the lines of service-to-service calls or client-to-service calls. However, OIDC was not built around authorization. It inherited a lot of OAuth principles, but focused more on authentication and identification of the user. They introduced things like ID tokens, added new scopes, allowed you to see information by having a user info endpoint. But the entire core of OIDC was, we already have authorization solved, let's solve identity a bit. And they kind of created the standard for all the social logins out there these days, like login with Google, login with Facebook, and so forth. Now, when you talk about OAuth2, OIDC, when you talk about authentication and authorization, you get to the fun point of tokens, right? A lot of people talk about the authorization and headers for APIs of saying you can use basic auth, which is very insecure. Please don't do it. I don't care what system you're in these days. If you're using basic auth, stop, find something else. Okay, I'll hold it closer. Realistically, tokens, you can go opaque. There's still value in going opaque tokens. Right now, a lot of API key systems, AWS uses API keys, so does many others. Those are considered, to an extent, opaque tokens. They don't have any representational data in them. To you, it's just a string that you have to send along. To the server, they do a lookup every single time. It's actually one of the problems with opaque tokens is every single time an opaque token comes in, you have to do a call to see is it valid to say, hey, can I let you through? And when you talk about modern architecture, you usually have a API gateway, or WAF, followed by an API gateway, followed by some other ingress controller that realistically all three should be checking the validity of that token. And if every single one of them has to make a call out, you start sacrificing good security practices for latency. So opaque tokens, they have their benefits, but try to avoid those and move more towards JWTs in the stateless manner. Now, the key thing, which if I had my laser pointer, would say is, just going to point, JWTs are not encrypted, okay? That's one of the big problems with JWT misconception is people think that any data I put in there, it's encrypted because it uses cryptography. It's not what it is. Laser pointer, sweet. You want it back. All right, it's now mine. So with the JWTs, they are cryptographically signed, which will allow you as a user to verify that it hasn't been tampered with. It allows you as a service to say, hey, I trust who this is coming from because I can verify the signature, and then we're able to, move on with the process of validating your authorizations or validating your identity. Realistically, JWTs do have one flaw where opaque becomes better is their length. JWTs can become bloated. Ideally, you don't want to shove too much information into them. This is where we get into modern authorization systems don't need all the information anymore because you're still doing lookups. So, starting from that terminology, everyone good? Everyone feeling good? Cool. All right, we'll move into the next part of authorization in APIs, which is scopes. What are they? Coarse-grained, fine-grained. My favorite term, coarsely fine-grained. And then what is their purpose? So scopes were introduced in OAuth 2 vaguely. There was a spec for it that you could add them. A lot of people didn't use them, but this is when you log in with Google, log in with Facebook, it says, would you like to share your first name, last name, profile with such and such website? You select yes, that's part of the user consent grant in OAuth 2, and that is their scope. That tells the consuming application that they're able to request for this set of data, the user has to agree to it and send it back. But the scopes generally come in two types, coarse-grained and fine-grained. And my previous time at companies, we developed a coarsely fine-grained terminology because when you work in a large enterprise that has many domains, doing very basic coarse-grained or doing very fine-grained gets to that balance of unmanageable that you have to kind of find a middle, and that's where you can do some coarsely fine-grained. So what are coarse-grained? Coarse-grained is a simple giving you access to read, write, update, delete. They're around the simple idea of saying, hey, you have the scope of update. Depending on what your resource is, you can kind of do those actions. They're very broad, looking for high-level entries, not really getting deeper grained into what access you may have or what authorizations you may have. Fine-grained is going a bit further. Now you have read photos, write calendar, read contacts. Now you're getting more specific, saying I can read the contacts. This is what I can do. I can go forward. Now, the downfall is when you start getting to, sorry if the font's small on this one, when you start getting into a large enterprise, you get into more complex domains to where you have a commerce domain, a fulfillment domain, an order domain, a product domain. And each one of them wants very coarse-grained things, but they also want to start limiting what you can do in each one of those domains. So you come up with what we call finely coarse-grained, where using a URN format is my favorite. You can use any format. You can do contextual things like, hey, for commerce, orders, write, I can post or create an order. But for products and prices, you can only read. And kind of going down to that balance of not going down to the individual fields that you have access to, but saying, hey, for these concepts, you have this level of access. So that handles scopes. Any questions there? Because I know I'm kind of moving quick. I have lots of slides and can talk for hours on authorization. So, all right. Now, what was it? Go ahead.
So, some of the scopes that you were talking about are, I'm allowing the system to do this for me.
Yep.
Giving it profile. But it seems like some of the other ones that you're defining there are, from the system's perspective, these are the only things you're allowed to do.
Yes.
So you can have both of those and both of those.
You can. So the question was, is some of the examples I gave were around a user granting access to an application to do actions on that user's profile, that user's content, and other scopes that I gave examples of is more around this is what you're allowed to do. And the reason why scopes kind of play in both realms is there's two parts to the story of authorization and service contact is on behalf of the user, which we'll cover in ACL shortly, along the idea of like I'm using FooBar app that wants my information from Google. On behalf of my account, I'm letting FooBar receive that information. Google designed those scopes around sharing. There's the other side of saying, well, I'm a PayPal developer. I signed up for PayPal access. I want to automate my system. They may only give me certain scopes that I'm allowed to call without becoming a partner, without becoming an internal application. So it's really around the context that you're calling. Is it system to system or is it user to system? And who is it on behalf of? That's where you kind of do that. Scopes are opaque tokens. They're strings. You can design them as anything, but you really want to take caution around making them too fine-grained for everything. In a large domain or a large enterprise, you're talking thousands upon tens of thousands. If you go too coarse-grained, everyone has access to everything. So you have to figure out the balance for your situation, your application, and your enterprise on what level it is. It's fun. It takes you lots of time and lots of mistakes, but you'll eventually find your path, as we found in many companies that we've done this in. So scope management is, this is one thing I'll say about any identity provider out there. They all talk about, oh, we have scope management. They don't have scope management. They have scope creation and they have scope, deprecation. They don't have scope management because most of them do not handle the relationships, what clients have them, all the tie-ins to understand, well, this one means this one means that. They don't really manage it. It's more of creation and deletion of scopes. So, any other questions? Cool. So the root of authorizations really comes down to an old terminology called access control list, ACLs. This is one of those terms that's been around for quite some time. You guys will start to recognize some of the acronyms here in a second as we talk about it, but the concept is really broken into three primary parts. You have the subjects, the resources, and permissions. Some documentation out there may call subjects users. I prefer subjects because it's not always a user. Sometimes it's a system. Sometimes it's an IoT device or a TV or whatnot. So when we talk about, I really should choose different font. These slide decks will be available for everyone. So a lot of content up here. I'm just kind of using it as a talking point. But subjects are really individual users, groups, roles, services, or principles, or processes, where it's along the idea of I'm acting on behalf of this. It could be, like I said, an IoT device, could be a phone app, it could be your logged in account. That is your subject. With a subject, they have access to resources. Resources in the API world could be the orders data, or it could be the user profile. It could also even be files on a server or directories that they have access to, like in Google Drive. It could be devices that they're allowed to print to. Those are all resources that they're able to leverage. And then they have permissions. What can they do on this thing? With these three core principles, you start getting into how do we do access control lists? How do we do authorizations across the board, right? And permissions can be as simple as read, write, execute, like we have with the file system, or they can be create, update, drop from database permissions, or even further to scopes and URNs and other type of mechanisms that we're going to talk about today. So when we put all these together, you effectively get is subject John can read and write to file A, right? In a very simple statement, that is what your ACL should accomplish. Now, what I've seen in many organizations is you get into group sprawl. I've actually been in an organization to where the number of groups was 3 times the amount of employees. So when that comes out, is that effectively means every employee has 3 groups that they're alone in, let alone if they're always cascading or groups within groups, it becomes a very messy thing. So they can be overused, but you can also, if you can control your sprawl of ACLs and really understand not only your application, but also the overall enterprise, you can really make good ACL lists upon very many different things. Now, effectively managing and understanding these components is critical for robust, secure system operation, but inadvertently, you're gonna screw up ACLs at some point. Just roll the punches, roll the flow, make the changes, but try to test it, try to do your due diligence. It's never gonna be 100%. Now, here's the fun part. Here's all the different ACLs that are on the internet that has actual documentation on. All of them have AC at the end, but there's also a fun acronym called DAC, which is Dynamic Access Control List. But all of these come to a different form of how to evaluate ACLs. You have the most common would be role-based, RBAC, if you ever heard that. You have ABAC, attribute-based. You get into CBAC, now you have 2 different ones. Context-driven, which is more about what time and place, what kind of along the policy line, but also, hey, did you just place an order? Okay, well, now you can't go to the admin screen because context feels like that's a malicious attack. Or did you hit us too many times that becomes a risk, which gets into the other fun one, which is risk-based access control. All these access control systems fundamentally do the same thing. It's what scope level are they at, right? And you can even break down access controls to say the root of them is really ACL, or really attribute-based, because all of these are attributes. They're all characteristics of a request. Your time-based one could be, hey, we don't let our services up at 9 a.m., right? You can't access it from Singapore at 2 a.m. You could be location-based, could be the new one, which we'll talk about briefly as relationship-based. But all of these really get down to the same thing. When I'm accessing data, when I'm building an application, do I know my users? Do I know what they should be able to do? Do I understand what they can do? And then ultimately, do I protect the data so they don't get access to what they shouldn't have? Any questions on these, and did I miss any? No? What was that?
I don't know, what time is it?
So how do ACLs work in context of APIs, right? That's why we're here. We're talking about authorization APIs. ACLs are the functions in the mechanisms to secure data access and manipulation. A good example of these is if we take a look of your API consumers are your subjects. These are the OAuth2 registered applications. These are your users using the front-end website. These are the folks that are, accessing the systems. They're using it through, different mechanisms, such as, like I said, individual user using your front end or mobile application, your applications, which are doing service to service or system to system access. And then you also have third parties who are acting on behalf of another subject. Log in with Facebook, log in with Google. You're acting on behalf of the user to access their data. You have API endpoints as resources. This is where you get into in a REST environment. We can talk about GraphQL and gRPC, but going with the common one of REST, your resources are really your endpoints. What data can I access? Can I access the order data? Can I access my, a single order? Can I access all orders? What can I access inside of them? What fields can I access? All those come from what are your resources enabling based on your ACL. And then permissions, this really comes down to, an application may allow admins to delete products, but only allow vendors to add them so that you have management controls. That gives you your permission levels. And it could be even as crazy as in multi-tenant systems, going around the idea of you can do anything in your multi-tenant system except for system level controls of deleting tenants. And we'll get into a live session. We'll bring up a browser and talk about relationship-based and the fun that you can have with it. So that covers a lot of the terminology in authentication authorization space. Any questions? All right. Did I just zoom past everyone? We all good? All right, cool.
Doing well.
All right. Why does authorization matter? We're going to do a little bit of case study. This is actually from an OSINT, OS Intelligence Operations. It's a group called Siphon on Discord. They went through a whole presentation around, let's take Bob, who's, poor Bob, is giving up more data than he thinks. So this is from Instagram. They go through and show and talk you through how to find out information about people. It's actually incredibly creepy. If you don't want to get into the world of security, just ignore it because it starts getting scary, what people can find. But Bob's profile shows name, shows a little bit of information, what the links are, how many posts, how many followers. So you would think that their API only reveals that information. However, by simply registering an application under a fake system, not giving up any real information, being a malicious user, you can access their API, which gives out his phone number, his email address, his location, as well as other things. They're violating a unintended data retrieval or field level access control. You can find more information in a lot of APIs that aren't presented in the UIs because they're not thinking about the access level needed for each application in context or what the context is needed to represent the data. The same group who showed this goes through court records where they find PDFs of incidents that have social security numbers on them from the government, freely and available. And they go through a bunch of other scenarios where they just mine data left and right through very scary means that were very simple to do. And they just talk about all of it all day long. But a lot of this comes down to, ultimately, what is the future of authorization? Why does that matter? Why does that case study matter? Because we need field level access control. We need to get to the point of FLAC. Field level access control is the advanced approach or the modern approach with the publishing of the white paper from Google called Zanzibar. It's how their entire cloud operations work. It's how their Google Drive system works. Basically, it's around the idea of relationship-based access control to really figure out what you have access to and why you have access to it through a breakdown of a graph or a relationship graph model. Their white paper is really interesting. It came out 2019. Funny enough, at a previous employer, we developed a system using URN-based approach versus their subject entity approach, which I'll show later. And it was very close to what they did, and we didn't know they were working on it or had it released. But it did give us a lot of that contextual authorizations based on relationship to an entity. But with FLAC, you get to the point of, well, I'm on an e-commerce site. I can create an order, but I can't modify the price of anything. I can't necessarily retrieve who the fulfiller is until I place the order or until the order is processed. I can't modify or see this information until the time is right or until the need or your access level is elevated to need that data. So with FLAC, why is it becoming essential is it's really coming to the point of privacy with the changes in the SEC around the disclosures when there's a breach that's happening, where you have to do software bill of materials. The board of directors can now get into legal issues for due diligence on security breaches. You're also having different states come out with their own version of CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. Vermont, Nevada, a bunch of other states are working on their own, and they're all different. So understanding your field level access and being very granular when you can access certain fields becomes much more important than just giving all the access because they logged in, today. It also allows you to think more architecturally and evolvable to where as you add more fields, which I've seen numerous times in production, someone does a select star in a database to return all the data. They add a new field. They don't have it mapped in their plain old Java object, crashes the whole system, and e-commerce is down for 3 or 4 days until they fix it. If you think about field level authorization and you think about field level access controls, you now have to think about your queries very specifically to say, well, what data am I querying? Because if I don't need it, why am I putting the pressure on the database to fetch it? Why am I doing the lookup on it if I don't need it? And then you get into a safer state of, I only give you the least privileged information, what you're allowed to have. I don't give you any more, and I don't give you any less. And you really get to a better state from a privacy perspective. Now, that allows you to minimize breach impact. You're not giving access to everything. Bob wouldn't have his phone number blasted all over the internet because we found it through an API. He could keep that information hidden. There's no reason anybody in Instagram needs your phone number except for the admins to call you for support or some other reason, right? You can give customized user experience in a multi-tenant system. You can start going through and analyzing, well, Tim is part of Engaged. He can see these 10 clients in a CRM application. The system can see all client or all accounts in the CRM application, but then further, they're part of only the North America region, so they can only see the North American accounts versus all accounts. You get into deeper level controls to prevent issues like the Okta experience, where a support agent from a third-party company got breached and had access to way too many clients' data for no reason, right? You can stop a lot of the Target in the HVAC system where they were able to tap into a lot more information than they probably should have. And I would go to bet that most of you could go into your current enterprise and access data that you're not really supposed to or need to have. Many times in a CMDB database or in a GitHub repository that is not controlled. And then granular audit trails. With all the regulation changes, with all the disclosure agreements and all the disclosure acts, we're going to get to a point that they're going to have to know, or we're going to have to disclose, breach A happened, what fields did they have access to, and what did they not get? And unless we have that field level access control and we have stronger audit trails, we can't produce that information. All we can say is, well, here's everything they could have access to, which may change your fine or your compensation to legal liability from $20 a user to $200,000 a user, depending on what information was breached. So, spotlight on new tools and solutions. A lot of database systems. Postgres recently came out with some new enhancements, as well as I know Mongo's working on some, if they don't already have them, to where they're having built-in field-level access controls, where they're giving it to where you can assign users or accounts specific access to things, or limit what data could all be retrieved at once, so that you can keep your audit trails separated out. You could do this, for quite a long time by separating your schemas, creating different user accounts to segment tables, but now they're getting down to individual field access for that user. Identity access management systems, folks like AWS IAM solution, they're introducing their own version of a Zanzibar or a fine-grained authorization system. A lot of times you'll hear field-level access control systems as fine-grained auth systems. We have Auth0, which is part of the Okta, who are actually the key sponsors and contributors to OpenFGA, which is an open source fine-grained authorization tool that follows the Zanzibar approach. They did it slightly different, but it follows that same approach. And then you also have the open source tools like ORY Keto, Permify, OpenFGA, and there's many more. There's Astro. I don't know, there's new ones that come out all the time, honestly, recently since the Zanzibar approach came out. So when we talk about those fine-grained authorization systems, architecturally, what you end up having to do is, remember how I said opaque tokens require a database hop every time? You have to start making conscious decisions of, when I do an access, fine-grained access control, do I query the authorization system every time? Do I create a cache of it so it's readily available? Do I do a federated model to where I can have that stuff updating? Or do I bake it into my database functions to where when I actually retrieve the data, it's already being evaluated? Those are concerns that you have to consider within your environment. A lot of times, if you're in the cloud environment, that extra hop over to the authorization server is so minuscule. If that's your pain point, you've solved a lot of problems. Go solve that one now. But realistically, your SSL termination, your database queries are probably need to be optimized before you try to shave off that little bit of latency calling these authorization systems. But ultimately, authorization is not something that is static. It is always evolving, that you probably need to do a live check every time, especially when you get to the meat of the data. Now, in that sense, if you have JWT coming in, you have to go through the WAF, go through the API gateway, go down to your actual microservice, using the JWT to prove they have the different levels of access to get further down the stack, you save a lot of those hops. But when they actually get to the raw data, take that, use it against the live authorization check, and validate they still have access. We used to use the term of, JWTs have an expiration date. Well, what if someone gets fired? Well, if the JWT time is so small, it doesn't matter. It's expired by the time they can do harm. But if you cache your authorizations or you only do a check at the entry point, you may not know that they don't have access to a field because an update just came out, or they just got denied access because they violated some other policy or some other risk-based, profile. And then when you really start talking about those, more detailed authorization systems, is you start stacking field level authorizations with risk-based authorization, with contextual-based authorization, and location-based. Now you really constrain the breach access or the field level access to, we know who our users are, we know how they're going to interact, they're not coming from Russia at 2 a.m. They're coming from the United States because we're a US company only, or they're coming from these pockets of the world because that's where we have people, right? You really get more control over your data. But integrating FLAC into existing systems. One is do an audit. Understand what data people have access to, what data comes out, what data is needed. Start doing a landscape assessment. Figure that out first. From there, start talking with business, start talking with your product teams to say, well, what data can we live without giving? And then how do we start building the model to say, as a user, this is how I get access to new data, this is how I add new data, and start working with some of those different systems or tools, which I'll pull up in a second, that you can really start exploring what is field level that you need to control and what is coarse grain that you don't need to control. Define your policies, establish clear policies, regarding who can modify, what can modify, really build a matrix of like what personas can do what levels of access can do what, and really get down to really mapping it all out, because you're gonna spend more time prepping than implementing at the end of the day. Because understanding auth and understanding the business side of auth, who needs auth, is a longer conversation than actually implementing it to get it going. And then implementation. Choose a tool that makes sense for you. There's lots of tools. I have experience with one in particular that I'll pull up, and we've had a lot of ease with it and a lot of benefits out of it. Or write your own if you understand the space well enough and want to do it special towards the company that you're working with. Sometimes that's needed. Test the hell out of it, realistically. Understand if you have the mapping done, you should be able to write a use case and create fake data in a lower environment for every single scenario and validate that that scenario is correct. If it's not, go back and figure out where it went wrong and really start analyzing every step of what you mapped out. Some of the tools, like I said, one that I'll cover is Permify. They actually have it built into their relationship model, their schema model, that you can start testing it with fake data so that you can get a coverage report to say, hey, we have 70% of the rules covered. And then you can start targeting the rules with fake data to make sure that you're covering what's there. And then training. That's going to be your next biggest one. Not only is it getting the business to understand authorizations, getting the security team on board and changing some of the models, because you might fight some legacy of like, oh, RBAC's all we need. Start challenging that model. But training is educating folks. A lot of people still walk away from the laptops leaving it unlocked, right? That's a big no-no. There's many reasons why. People still, handle data through email to where it's spreadsheets of information because they need to send it to a friend to do, some data graphs on it. All those things are where we can educate folks on why they shouldn't be sending this data. And then start talking about, well, would you want, XYZ to get this data if it was breached? Start educating folks, start talking to folks around authorizations, and really get them to understand why it's important now more than ever, because the attack vectors are coming and they keep coming. So that is covering kind of like the terminology, kind of like the high-level stuff going into it. I'm going to show you a product that is called Permify. It is one that we've picked up. I've done a lot of conversations with their team. I've worked extensively with them on feature sets of what we can do or what we should be able to do. They're very active community. They actually just recently moved their headquarters to the United States from, I think, Turkey. But it is something that we are going to be able to leverage within this conversation. That is a really dark screen. I should also pop into a new workspace. So we'll see about blowing this up too, so you all can see it. Can the stream see it well? All right. All right. So Permify is based on the idea of relationships. And when it comes into relationships, it really has an entity, a user entity, an organization entity, a repository entity. It comes into having the subject, that entity, has permission, has a relationship to the entity. So a user has a relationship to an organization based on here, has a relationship to a repository. What that allows you to do is start building out a graph, and we'll show in the visualizer, of what somebody can do at what given point. So if you're a user, you are either an owner, a member, or an admin of an organization, which is a parent or an owner of a repository. This allows you as an owner that you can delete a repository, you can edit a repository if you're an admin or an owner, and you can view a repository if you're a member. This is a relationship-based model. This is a very standardized organizational hierarchy. Now, let's go into a more advanced one. Here we go. Let's see if this works. So if we go into Disney Plus, you can start getting into more advanced models that you can easily define via schema. From a security perspective, in your audits and your reviews, it's easy English, it's easy, connections about what someone can do, how they can do it. You even get down to where you can, do functions of checking their age and baking it into the authorization check based on the context that you're sending in. So when I do an authorization check, I can actually send, not only can, Tim view this account, but I can also say, by the way, Tim's age is 10. And it could say, nope, Tim can't view this account, he's not old enough, or he can't view this movie because he's not old enough, right? You can start sending in contextual information to not only the entity authorization, but also any of the checks that you want to retrieve. So it allows you to, check regions, check age. Those are good examples of what you can do with authorizations and the contextual data. And when you look at this visualizer and go through, you start noticing, let me try to do this without a mouse. It's all kinds of fun on a Mac. There we go. Sorry if that gave you any motion sickness or whatnot. So when you start, looking at this visualizer, you start saying that, well, as a user, I'm an owner. As a user account, I can create a profile, which is tied to an account. I'm an owner of an account. Well, as an owner of the account, I can delete, edit, or create a watch list. I can delete a profile, I can edit a profile, and I can create a watch list. And with that profile, as the owner of the profile, I can create a user, right? I can remove content, I can I can edit the watch list, I can delete the watch list, I can remove content from the watch list, and I can start viewing the content based on that. And with the content having a relationship, or watch list having a relationship to the content, now I can start saying, well, what's the age rating of the content? Should Tim be able to view that content on that watch list if their age is not old enough, if their profile age is under, the kid's profile? Even though I make a watch list with R-rated movies that I could share with my entire family, it still prevents Tim from being able to see it because he's not old enough, right? And this really gives you finer grained authorization models, which, by the way, Permify and Zanzibar, they didn't revolutionize this. You could have done this with very advanced queries. They've made it easier. They've simplified it, and they made it into a structural way that you can test it, validate it, and also prove coverage with the authorization model. This particular website, Permify itself, you can actually go in and add data, sample data. You can also do enforcement checks where you can run scenarios. They have a lot of documentation. They do have a schema validator that is all written in YAML. You put the schema in there. You can run coverage reports and run sample data. I wish I had one prepared for you, but I could get one and let Leslie and them share the slide deck as well as a sample YAML file with that information. But you start noticing with this type of model is it works for user groups. We can still do RBAC in this system, which gives you that relationship model, if it will load. All right, maybe not. But you can also end up using it, with custom roles inside of a system to where you create different roles, you give them different access. And with any of these entities, like when we get to field-based level control, these entities can be your fields. You can create an entity called fields and insert what fields someone has access to. It's a very open system that allows you to create any entity that you can query to say, what can Vic have access to? What fields for a repository can Vic access? And it can spit back in that query, Vic can view Vic can modify and tell you what actions they can do on what field. Then using that response, you can evaluate the request coming in to say, well, it says Vic can modify this field, so let him modify this field. And you can just iterate through your incoming requests to say, field by field, let's check what they can do. And then you have full field level access control, as well as relationship-based access. So now when Vic moves from one organization to another organization in the company, here's a crazy thought, you don't have to go request anything if it's tied to your HR system, like a Workday or any other system. When that update happens, well, Vic is now moved from data operations over to security. He loses access to all data operations stuff because he's moved orgs. That org update could be tied to send an event to change his permissions. Well, now it's all automatic based on your org structure. And if you start building these org structures or you start building these hierarchy structures from the get-go or from the ground up with field level access in mind, you start getting into very automatable ways or very good ways to stay current with systems that we've probably all developed over the 20, 30 years of computing, to where we've reinvented the wheel every time to order, to manage an org structure or to allow access in group management and clean up the hundreds of thousands of groups that no one needs. We've done this 1,000 times. This is a new approach that may make more sense. What if you reorg? Well, here's the beautiful thing. If you reorg, you should have old org name, new org name, send the event to tell it that, hey, all these people in this org now do this org, should have all the same permissions. Depends on how you define your schema. It should be really easy to with a relationship-based model. In fact, I would say that's one of the benefits is now reorgs happen. You don't have to reinvent all the hierarchies, all the reporting, all the access controls. You don't even have to go in and rename the groups because you use the prefix for that organization or move them out of a resource group or a virtual network or a subscription in Azure because the name changed. So, glad you. Yep. Is this the next evolution of Open Policy Agent? No. Yes and no. I'll put it that way. Open Policy Agent is really good around validating policies or being a policy decision point to say, can somebody do an action or can some action take place? It is, in my opinion, when I've looked at it and used it, it is great for checking against policies such as using Terraform to launch IAC, infrastructure as code, up into Azure and say, hey, before this runs in Azure, can I check to see if you have a public IP? Can I check that you have these certain attributes turned off or you're not using this particular module? That is where I think Open Policy Agent shines. Where it doesn't shine is, unless they've made advancements, I haven't kept up with it on certain points, is the integration into the actual data, being able to store the data alongside of it. If you look at a lot of Open Policy Agent, it's just a formula or a function that says, given the context, do all these things check? It has no knowledge of the actual storage mechanism underneath. It doesn't have an index of all the things that are available to that relationship. So I think you can use them together. I think Open Policy Agent is more suited for those static style checks, things that are kind of driven towards security policies versus access level or authorization levels, versus where this shines really in authorization levels. That's cool. Does that answer the question?
So with Verify, you're storing the schema as well as some of the data that would be
Yes.
in your database within Verify, and that will give you kind of the resulting of what you're allowed to do. You still have to go back to the source system to get
The real data, yes. So this gives you the identifiers and the actions that you're allowed to do. They've actually, and this is where, and to be transparent on this, if we go to the, yes. Oh, that's cool. Oh, because it locked. Yep, 1 second. I'll get that back up. Unless you like the pretty flowers. Pretty flowers. Fast, sources, screen, Riverside. Cool.
So I got a follow-up to Charlie's question there, right? So kind of on theme with this, we've been talking about reorgs. So
Yep.
is it, I do a reorg, I reshuffle my organization hierarchy.
Yep.
Is it on me to shove that into Permify to let it know things have changed because the relationship structure is different now?
Yes. Now, the benefit there is you're effectively, if depending on how your implementation is, my suggestion would be is if you're using a system that can produce webhooks, with that webhook event, you could automate that entire change. Basically by saying, look up old group, insert new group, right? You could automate it. Yes, you still have to do that work. Now, what you can do is also make it to where a lot of that data becomes based on your schema. A lot of this is heavily based on how you create your schema. You can make it to where it's a single bit flip based on the users versus shifting every API that's under an organization to a completely different organization. You could have the structure to where this user has access to these 10 APIs instead, right? And then it doesn't really matter what the org is. A lot of that comes up to you. Now, with Zanzibar, there is a Zanzibar.academy, which is operated by Auth0. It talks about the principles of Zanzibar, and then they use more of the Zanzibar language to do this, but it really talks around the scenarios of why the tuples, as they use to represent these authorizations, really matter. Permify took a slightly different storage approach, slightly different terminology or how they communicate them via APIs. That one thing that I found with OpenFGA, which caveat, I haven't seen it in 3 months if they've changed it, but OpenFGA, Astro, and a few others, you couldn't do a filter to say, show me everything that Vic can do. So I can do a full audit to say, okay, well, Vic was, left the company for different engagement. What can he do? And that way we can see that his replacement gets all the same access. Or, hey, let's go ahead and terminate this because he left the company. Now we can know what data he had access to if there's a breach in the next month or so. We can know how it could be affected. A lot of the other OpenFGA or the other fine-grained authorization systems didn't have the filtering capabilities to say, show me everything Vic can do, or show me everything or show me anyone who can touch API A, and it would show a full list of who can do what permission they have, and give you the full graph.
So what you're saying with historical stuff is it kind of has some journaling built into it?
Yes. And you can do the filtering. You can get the full data thing of being able to build out, which I'm sure GitLab and GitHub did this in a very different way, but same principle. When you go into any of those systems and you see here's who can contribute, here's who can maintain, here's who can read the repo, it's that same thing of you could say, hey, show me the permissions for this repository and just dump it out. And you don't have to store all that data inside your database. It's now part of the authorization system. Your database, your resource is really about the content or the resource itself. Because a lot of times we pollute our resource tables in databases with ownership models or ownership data that now there is no owners in it. It's inside the authorization system, which also gives you more flexibility later to say, cool, now we don't have to rename or restructure a database because we need to change from owner to a different terminology or different structure to become multi-tenancy. We just change our permission schema, and now we can achieve the same thing. No, don't do it. Cool. Sorry, if it locks, it loses the stream. But there are a few. Like I said, Permify is just one I have most experience with. I could talk most about it. OpenFGA is by Auth0, by Okta. They produced it. It follows Zanzibar. They ran the Zanzibar Academy. There's Casbin, there's Astro, there's a few others. There's even more coming out, and more solutions are looking to do this. Because in the end, for one, if you look at the schemas, it's very readable. It's very understandable. If you go back to the old ways that we did it with database linking tables and lookups, we would have to analyze gigabytes of data, depending on your users, to figure out who could do what and how. Dang it. All right, anyways, that's all I have for there. Any questions? Deployment look like for Permify? For any of them. I'll speak to Permify on that one, because I don't know the others very well. Deployment looks as you would like it to look, in the sense of it is a Go binary. It does install, it's a simple Go container. or a Docker container if you want, or it's running a Go binary that you can throw into a unikernel. If you don't know about unikernels, we should talk about those. Or you can deploy it out to a Kubernetes cluster. It is needing access to a database. So Permify chose Postgres because of the cloud availability of it, the fact that it's open, it's open and out there. A lot of people know it. So they use that as their backing store. From the deployment side of it, depending on how complex your ecosystem is, you could do it per app. Permify is a multi-tenant, multi-app schema system. You can technically store your entire enterprise into one Permify cluster and everyone access that one cluster. Depending on the size of your enterprise, if it's 10 groups, 10 applications, maybe that makes sense. If it's 70 groups with 40 applications per group, doesn't make sense, right? You want to start isolating.
Does it have any integration or way to suck in like an Active Directory and produce that?
No, that is a void in all of these actually is there is no connector between Active Directory. Oh, sorry, the question was, does Permify or any of these systems have a way to suck in Active Directory or groups or LDAP and kind of make it a thing or convert it over? No, there isn't. I'm actually working on an idea with the Permify folks around that concept of a bridge to allow Permify updates to broadcast to AD so that the systems that still understand AD or understand SAML or understand those other mechanisms can still function, but we never have to deal with groups again as people. The ideal there is we're still having people use SOAP and SAML, and we're 20 years past a lot of that mechanism, that we can't get people to do OIDC all the time. We're never gonna get them to change from group names to manage their auth to relationship in a timely manner. So let's build the bridge and start the new stuff on the new technology. But it depends on your environment, ecosystem, how you want to do it. Now, one of the scenarios that I'm also working with the Permify folks on, at least the idea is, there is a need in organizations, and I don't know if the others have solved it, is there's a global schema as well as an app schema, and you want both of them in a sense. For instance, if I'm building a bunch of internal applications, I don't want every internal application to have to build the org chart in their schema. I don't want them to have to save the org chart data in their schema, in their instance. It would be nice if I could federate that from one parent node to children node that says, here's the global schema, everyone gets it, you can build off of that. Or find a way to do it. I don't think it's gonna be baked into the product. I think it's gonna be one of those of, hey, we built another system to kind of manage that, a control plane per se, but at least the idea of how do we get the big things, org charts, multi-tenant systems, to propagate down to disparate applications without them reinventing the wheel. Any other questions?
I know you lost your video again, but like, so it was cool, like you were showing the policies and the testing and stuff. Like, are there examples in the playground, anything of how you actually consume it as a developer?
Not in the playground. Well, their playground actually consumes it from their sample database if you wanted to run it. But they do have a lot of examples that you can download it, spin one up, play with it, and consume it. But let me get the stream back up. What was that? Oh, yeah, he asked if there's any examples in the playground, the Permify playground, on how to consume it. And like I mentioned, they don't necessarily, if you actually dig into their API calls that are happening, you could, deduce what they're doing, but they do have really good documentation. I just have to get back to it. Permify.co. So when you go into their documentation, not only do they have using the API where they talk about the schema service, how to write a schema, you can play around in their environment, but they go through, they do have Postman collections, or at least show you how to test it in Postman, and they go through. The biggest one to me of like why we chose Permify initially for a project over some of the others is really around the lookup entity and the subject permission list. Was really the ideas that we needed to say, in a Go, they have a Go SDK. So, hey, let me check this subject permission. let me see, tenant ID 1, here's some metadata on the request. Does user 1 have access to repository 1 in the tenant ID 1 for that app? And you'll get back a result set that says, delete result allowed, edit result allowed. And if it's denied, it would say result deny, right? So it really makes it clear on what they're allowed to do, what access they have, and what entities they even have. And with their API, they're constantly evolving it. If you have any issues or you want to dive in more, join their Discord. They are fantastic at answering, even if you don't have enterprise support. But if you do get enterprise support, they're even faster at responding. I've hopped on several calls with them before we actually engaged with them on a project to say, hey, what could we do? What can we get out of this? So they've been fantastic so far. But a lot of the common use cases is they do talk about multi-tenancy, talk about attribute-based, the relationship-based, but they also, somewhere in their documentation, I have to find it, you can do the field level stuff. They do talk about it in sales organizations and as a use case, as well as HIPAA or regulated environments to say, this is how you can leverage it to where, all doctors can see basic information of a patient, but only the GI can see the gastro stuff, or only surgery can see the surgery scheduled, or things like that, right? You can start segmenting that data versus some of the current systems where every nurse, every doctor can look up everything, which isn't always the best. In a POC, we have tested it, and we actually started in an early edition of like 0.2, and now they're on 0.7, I think, or 0.5, and they've added so many features, we have to go back and rework our model because they solved a lot of the complexities that we baked into our model. Now they made it 10 times easier that our model is a lot cleaner. We did it at the data services. The services accessing the database. And the reason why, when we did the POC, is it goes back to that data filtering. What we did is we created bounded query context calls to our database to say, hey, let me check permissions of Vic. What can Vic do? Or what APIs can Vic see? It would return a list of all the IDs that he could see or all the IDs that they could do this action on. We would take that return and put it into the select all, or select these fields from database where API ID in this list. So we only retrieve what he was allowed to see. We never retrieved anything that he wasn't allowed to see. We always did bounded context queries to never return more data than he should be able to see. That was our POC. That is what sold us on solving this problem. Because
and that's a big problem I have doing security implementation, because anybody, like doing a single resource check, you can do anything in the world. When you have 400,000 records and you need to show people they get to see 30 of them, you can't run it 400,000 times and say no minus 40 of them, right? This kind of stuff is really critical, and that's where you end up writing a lot of gross stuff to make the list use case work.
Yep.
These things, right?
And the other thing that we're now looking into is it's part of the next iteration is, can we put the list of fields as an entity of what people have access to based on their relationship to the API to say they can retrieve these 10 fields, not all 50 fields for the data model, and then query that as well to say, well, what fields can they access and what API, what IDs can they access? Now we get the select insert fields where in ID equal blah. Now we get really restricted on, here's the data you can see, here's the APIs you can see, we've tied it all together. Our queries become much more indexable, much faster, because we're very specific on what we want. And we're able to then use that data to shift and change without massively overhauling on the next iteration.
I think this still can get gross if what fields you can see for a resource varies, like in a list API. Like, you still have to check everything that comes back at that point.
Not necessarily, because you tell them what access they have. So when you create the entity or you create the field list, you can say, Vic has access to name, Vic has access to last name.
I'm saying, like, if I'm like viewer, owner, viewer, something like that. Like,
Yep.
the one I'm owner, all of a sudden I get a whole bunch more stuff. That can be hard to do in aggregate. Like, you'd have to do that on a one-off
So I think there's a solution there within the relationship base that you don't have to do more than you think there is. I think you can end up still getting it because in the end, the result for that field or for that API, depending on how you wire it back, you could possibly even get that this API has these fields available. There might be some things that are not available yet, but hey, that's a good feature. Let's go, knock on their door and say, hey, can you do this? If you can't already. But one thing, to your point is when you talk about actions, you can actually create actions where they're ors, they're ands, they're complex to where you can even put function delimiters in there to say, hey, you can be an owner or a member and or a guest with this level of access, right? So you can do all kinds of different checks and authorization logic to say we support, a wide variety of scenarios versus the traditional ABAC where everything's hard-coded. You're checking one field, and now you need to add another field, and you get a logic bomb because you've updated it in 2 APIs, but not all 5, right? This starts to simplify that because you're using the same standard across them all. You're dealing with relationships and permissions and really ACLs. Any other questions? No? All right. Oh, I realized that I completely forgot to do the first slide, which I don't know why it was first, is, who am I and why do I talk about this? So that's me. I am a published author for Kong, Becoming a King of API Gateways. That was a fun experiment with Bleeding Edge Press. We actually wrote that book in the event of 2 weekends. All of us woke up. I woke up really early because a lot of them are overseas. We wrote our outlines for the chapters we were writing, and we were able to get all the rough drafts done in 2 weekends. They polished it up with editing in another 2 weekends, and within a month we published. It was a crazy fun time, but it also kind of sucked because it was a lot of writing in a short amount of time. But my background is I had 11 years at Cengage Learning, primarily around Cengage Learning is a publishing company for college textbooks. If you went to college, I'm sorry, they sold you very expensive books. Even more so, they sold you very expensive access to content, which I was part of the SSO team there. So I helped a lot of their permissions and entitlements, which gave me a lot of the ideas when I started working on other SSO systems to think more of just log in or log out. It's more of log in, but you only have these entitlements or these access controls. And then I joined Kroger. I did a little bit of work on their picking solution, but helped co-found with Nick Scavelli and who was our leader at that point? Matthew Groom, I think. We co-founded the API program to where we spun up an identity provider where Tim Kelly from Engage was helping us build the identity provider in Go, diving headfirst into that, to ultimately become the lead architect of the global gateway architecture that powers the API program at Kroger to enable a billion-dollar cost avoidance saving company or organization within that company. And then recently I joined P&G to where kind of becoming the product manager and architect of the API marketplace, much like a developer portal, but more focused, as well as the leader in the API program, specifically around enabling engineering teams to develop APIs better, more securely, and give them the tools that they need to succeed. And all my socials, as you'll notice, a common theme. I go by the name Ionite Online. If you find that name, it's probably me. I've been using that for a decade or so. Oh, yeah. So this crazy photographer, not to name names, Heckler, took that photo for me. So, cool. All right. If not, any questions, then it's been a pleasure. All right. It's been a pleasure. Next month, we have No Name. Yep. So we have No Name presenting, talking about one of the topics around API security. We have plenty to go over with them on what they should talk about or what we could have them talk about. So look forward to that event. And if you guys want to talk yourselves, reach out to us. There's no one stopping you from coming up here and speaking and talking about API security, right? We want to encourage that community support, and we'll continue to bring content. If you all want to join in on that content, great. So, awesome.